What if I told you that the very foundation of what we were taught to eat, the food pyramid, was created more than 30 years ago, pushed into government policy, taught in schools, and followed by millions of people, and that today the government quietly admitted it needed to change? What if I told you that while we were told to base our diets on grains and limit fat, obesity, diabetes, cancer, and heart disease exploded? And now, decades later, that guidance is being reversed? Today, I want to walk you through what the food pyramid is, why it was created, who was behind it, and how it became part of official government policy. What happened to public health while we followed it, and what changed today with the newly released dietary guidance, including a long overdue reduction in sugar recommendations. Welcome to Think and Lose Weight, where we focus on longevity, health span, and the simple things we can all do every single day to make sure our best years are still ahead of us in our 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. My name is Luis. I'm 57 years old and I'm not a doctor. I'm someone who has spent decades paying attention, experimenting, learning from my mistakes, and watching what actually works in the real world, not just on paper. Check out the video description. I have some cool recommendations there. Let's start at the beginning. The food pyramid most Americans recognize was officially introduced in 1992 by the United States Department of Agriculture. That's over 30 years ago. The goal was to create a simple visual guide that showed people what to eat more of, what to eat less of, and how to structure a so-called healthy diet. But the pyramid didn't exist in isolation. It was tied directly to the dietary guidelines for Americans, which since the mid-1990s have been mandated by Congress and updated every 5 years. Once those guidelines became federal policy, they influenced school lunch programs, military meals, hospital nutrition standards, SNAP benefits, and nutrition education nationwide. This meant the advice reached nearly every American at some point in their life, often starting in childhood. In other words, it wasn't just advice, it became policy. At the base of that original pyramid were grains, bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, recommended in large daily servings, sometimes 7 to 9. Fat was pushed toward the top. Sugar was barely addressed, and the public message was simple and consistent. Eat low fat, eat plenty of carbohydrates, and trust that moderation would take care of the rest. Now let's talk about what happened while we followed that advice. Since the early 1990s, obesity rates in the United States more than doubled. Type 2 diabetes went from relatively uncommon to epidemic levels. Fatty liver disease became widespread. Heart disease remained the leading cause of death, and many cancers closely associated with metabolic dysfunction increased. This didn't happen overnight, and the food pyramid wasn't the only factor. But it is impossible to ignore that decades of official dietary advice failed to protect the population from chronic disease, and in many cases coincided with worsening outcomes. One of the most important omissions in the original guidance was sugar. For years, sugar was treated as something to limit, but it was never aggressively called out as a primary driver of metabolic disease. And that wasn't accidental. Historical records and internal documents have shown close relationships between the sugar industry and government advisory bodies going back to the 1960s and 1970s. Sugar industry groups funded research designed to downplay sugar's role in heart disease while shifting blame toward fat. Those studies were later cited in policy discussions and helped shape decades of dietary messaging. As a result, fat was demonized. Sugar quietly stayed in the food supply, and highly processed foods packed with sugar and refined carbohydrates exploded onto grocery store shelves. So while people were told to avoid fat, they were unknowingly consuming more sugar than ever before. Fast forward to today. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the USDA released updated dietary guidance for 2025 to 2030, and with it, a redesigned food pyramid. This new model is essentially inverted compared to the old one, and the messaging is dramatically different. The emphasis is now on real food, whole foods, minimally processed foods. Protein is elevated. Vegetables and fruits are prioritized. Healthy fats are acknowledged as part of a balanced diet. And for the first time, in a very direct way, added sugar is being explicitly reduced and discouraged. That change alone is historic. The new guidance openly acknowledges that excessive sugar intake plays a meaningful role in obesity, diabetes, and metabolic disease. This is something that should have been addressed decades ago, but better late than never, right? Another major change is protein. The updated recommendations suggest higher protein intake ranges than the older baseline standards. That matters tremendously for men over 40 like us. After 40, muscle loss accelerates. Muscle isn't about appearance, it's about metabolism, insulin sensitivity, balance, strength, and independence as you age. Lose muscle, and everything becomes harder. The updated guidance finally reflects that reality. Here's the biggest change in the newly dietary guidelines, and it's a quiet admission that the old approach wasn't working. For decades, the official message was build your diet on grains, keep fat low, and treat protein like a smaller side item. The new guidance shifts the priorities. It puts a stronger emphasis on protein and what they're calling healthy fats, and pushes refined carbohydrates and added sugar further out of the daily routine. Why does that matter, especially for men over 40? Because protein is the one micronutrient that protects muscle. And muscle is not just for looks, it's your metabolic engine. It helps with blood sugar control, insulin sensitivity, strength, balance, and independence as you age. If you undereat protein while you try to lose weight, you don't just lose fat, you lose muscle too. And once you lose muscle, your metabolism slows and everything gets harder. The second big shift is fat. For years, fat was treated like the enemy. Now the guidelines are acknowledging that certain fats belong in a healthy diet. Fats that come with real food like eggs, dairy, olive oil, avocados, nuts, and fish. Those fats help with satiety, hormone production, and stable energy. When people eat low fat, high carb diets, they often end up hungrier, snacking more, and chasing cravings all day. And then there's the carbohydrate piece. The new guidance de-emphasizes the heavy grain-based foundation and moves people toward fewer refined carbs and fewer ultra-processed foods. That's a big deal, guys, because the more refined carbs you eat, the more your insulin stays elevated. And chronically high insulin drives fat storage, especially visceral fat. So the direction is clear: more protein, better fats, fewer refined carbs, and less sugar. Built around real food, not factory food. There is also a much stronger emphasis on food quality. Highly processed foods are no longer treated as neutral. They are identified as a problem. Food engineered for overconsumption, loaded with sugar, refined starch, and industrial seed oils are now recognized as contributors to chronic disease. That is big. That alone represents a major philosophical shift away from the idea that all calories are equal. So, what does this mean for you? It means the government is quietly admitting that the old framework didn't work. It means decades of advice built around grains, low fat, and moderation failed to protect public health. And it means nutrition guidance is finally moving back toward what many people have already discovered on their own. Real food works. Protein matters. Sugar is not harmless. Highly processed foods undermine health over time. For men between 40 and 70, this matters more than ever. You're not trying to be shredded, you're trying to be healthy. You're trying to reduce visceral fat. You're trying to protect muscle. You're trying to stay strong, mobile, and independent as you age. If even a modest percentage of people follow this new guidance by reducing sugar, prioritizing protein, and eating real food, the long-term public health impact could be enormous. But policy alone won't fix the problem. Individual choices still matter. And the biggest takeaway is this: don't wait for the government to catch up before you take responsibility for your health. Use this update as confirmation, not permission. Because the truth is, many of us already knew this. Real food works. Less sugar works. Protein matters. Longevity is built one decision at a time. If this video helped put today's news into perspective, like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you on the next one.